Portal Williams.
Mr. Speaker, there is no more important job of this House than to keep our children safe. And I, for one, am hopeful that the work on this piece of legislation will do just that. Mr. Speaker, as a parent, there is nothing that is that makes you more fearful than harm that may befall your child. And I know that that parents who I've spoken to, whose children have been offended in the manner that is described in this bill, are incredibly emotional about what happens to their children. So, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity to look at the impacts of sexual violence on our children and do something really useful about it. Mr. Speaker, there have been many speakers who have talked about what the potential for this bill is. In a previous life, having worked in family violence, not necessarily in sexual violence, but in family violence, I have spoken about having run a refuge where we used to say that 6 women and a piece of paper was all we had to keep our women and our tamariki safe. And in this regard, we may be falling into the same kind of trap, that a register which for all intents and purposes is designed to keep our children safe, may not achieve that. Because we know that a register will register those who have already offended and will do nothing about protecting our children from the harm that may befall them from those predators who we know nothing about in the community. So 1% of sexual offences actually reported to the police. So when we are talking about recording small numbers of known offenders and doing nothing about protecting our children from the prevalence of sexual violence in our community, and we know that is prevalent. We know from the statistics around mental health, we know from the statistics around suicide that sexual violence is prevalent in our community, and I don't believe that without proper mechanisms, support, therapy in place, that a register of known sex offenders will achieve what we want to achieve to keep our children safe. This bill, Mr. Speaker, talks about an arbitrary period of time that offenders will be on the register, 8 years, 15 years or life. There's been no discussion about the validity of those dates. Is 8 years better than 7 years, or would it be better to have 10 years? We need to actually have some real valuable information to ensure that whatever period we have for people on the register for is useful. The other thing that we should be considering, Mr. Speaker, which doesn't appear anywhere in the bill that I can see, is the requirement for offenders to actually get treatment. Because there is no point in saying that after a period of time, a sex offender is no longer risky. There needs to be a prescription of treatment and monitoring that work has been completed by that offender. And that doesn't appear anywhere in the bill. The bill talks about the actual criteria by which you will appear on the register. You must be over 18 at the time of the offence and convicted of a qualifying offence. And it can be custodial or non-custodial. And also a sentencing judge can put you on the register at their discretion. There is nothing about the nature necessarily of the offending, the nature of the treatment that offender will take on board, and then again there is nothing about his or her level of risk to children going forward that appears in this bill, except for an arbitrary date. I have real concerns about who will have access to the information about people who appear on the register. We're talking about staff from the Ministry of Social Development, from Housing New Zealand. I can kind of understand what that's about the placement of sex offenders into the community. But I don't feel comfortable, Sir, about the level of protection of that data once it is opened to scrutiny by various members of those organisations. There is also some talk that caregivers, teachers and others will also have access to the names. That is one very small step away from a public register, Mr. Speaker. And I don't believe that the level of scrutiny that is required to be applied has been given to that very core detail around the privacy of your information. There is very little that holds this piece of legislation to ensure privacy of offenders if it is opened up to many other people getting access to that information. I, for one, am not suggesting that we don't have a register of some sort, but I would really want to ensure that there is a high level of protection around that information and that it is only used in the manner with which it should be. But we know, Mr. Speaker, this is a hugely emotional subject matter, particularly for parents and for other members of the community who want to keep their children safe. And getting access to that information could result in a terrible unintended consequence. And I, for one, want to make sure that I would be comfortable about the storage and the access of this data. Because, I mean, we say right in the very explanatory notes, right at the very beginning, that the register will reduce reoffending against child victims. And I'm not sure that this bill actually will achieve that. There's quite a prescription about the reporting mechanism, the terms of reporting, restrictions around travel, and they proceed for a significant period of time. And I do want to refer to the concerns of the Auditor General in that that these provisions are inconsistent with Section 9 of the Bill of Rights Act, that even after someone has potentially paid for the crime that they have conducted, they are still required by this bill, Sir, to continue to be monitored, to continue to report, to continue to have their access to freedom restricted. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer to, because it hasn't really been touched on anywhere, the opportunity to get treatment or therapy to ensure that you are no longer a risk as a sex offender. And I want to refer to a report that came out of the Department of Corrections, and it's quite an old report, 2002-2003. But it talks about the overall recidivism rate as being 8.1% across the 3 programs that the Corrections Department conducted. But that recidivism rate for people who completed their treatment program was 5.2%, a reduction of almost half. If we don't have a mechanism in our legislation to ensure we get good therapeutic interventions, we miss actually providing safety from at least half of the offenders who will offend again, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that when this bill goes to the Select Committee, there are many questions to be asked around those types of provisions. Mr. Speaker, we are supporting this bill to Select Committee. I am honoured to be able to sit on the Select Committee and to be able to ask those questions, and I commend the bill to the House. Thank you, Sir.
I call Stuart Smith.